Let's take a look at some different techniques for how we can keyframe and work with overlap, follow through, secondary animation and the like. Here we just see a simple, two bone animation here, a little type of pendulum thing, and you can see that both bones are swinging. However, there's no kind of offset or overlap between their timings. They are, perfectly in time with one another. And consequently, it doesn't look very slick or very natural in any way. So how can we build a bit of that in? Well, the simplest way is going to be just to take their keyframes out of time alignment. So if I take the second bone here, and I'll just select all of the keys for it here, and let's bump them up by, 1, 2, 3 frames, shall we say. If we now watch it play back, suddenly it's got this little waggle and wave on it. Starts to look a lot more natural. We have overlapping action. And there we go. That's the most basic technique, and it's incredibly simple and easy to get to grips with. As you work down a hierarchy of items to provide some overlapping action, you simply just offset their time from one another. And this is perfectly fine in a number of situations, and you will see us use this method when we get into the actual business of animation projects. However, it's not always that great or appropriate, and there can be a couple of issues with it. First of all, let's select both bones here. What we see, of course, now in our track editor, or perhaps if we have a look in our spreadsheet editor here, is of course the offset timing between all of these frames. Now let's suppose, of course, that we want to retime this animation somehow. Well, we can do stuff in, of course, the new scene editor here by perhaps just, expanding the time for all of these keyframes here, just like this. That, of course, keeps them with their same timing offset from one another. But look at some of the strange occurrences that you pick up on account of that. This funny double keying, things have become a little bit messy. Alternatively, of course, if you were just, selecting pairs of keys or groups of keys and wanting to nudge them around in time like this, when you've got just two items like this, then of course it's very simple. But of course, imagine that this is a hierarchy with a shoulder and an elbow and a wrist and maybe something on the fingers and other stuff. This timeline is going to begin to get pretty bogged down with lots of keyframe overlaps, and it's hard to see where the actual blocks of each part of the movement are. Whilst this is a very simple technique for very quickly and easily creating overlapping action, what it leaves you with is a very messy arrangement of keyframes that can be very hard to, go and tween properly or retime or manage in, any other particular way that you're needing. There's a wonderful little article on this that I came across some years ago here on the Keith Lango blog, which is a little old now, but still fortunately present. It does have an awful lot of interesting animation notes and lessons if you want to look through. But there's this one article, Breakdowns Can Be Such a Drag, Building Better Overlaps, wherein he goes through some of these problems. And of course you can see here where you've got a little example of the kind of messy keyframe arrangement or dope sheet that you can wind up with when you've got offset time keys spread throughout a character like this. Go and have a look. Very interesting article. But the long and short of it is that he suggests another method that is useful a lot of the time, and that is to keep keys in line with one another. So, here we are, the keys are in line, but what we're going to do instead is to build in our overlap simply by keying it. So here we're coming on the downstroke, 3 frames, and what we'll do is simply just push this bone back there. Come to that frame, 1, 2, 3 afterwards, push it back again, 1, 2, 3 afterwards, overlap it some more, 1, 2, 3 afterwards, overlap it some more, and of course you're getting the general idea here, and you start to see that right there we've got overlap built in, but it's built in to our keyframes themselves. Essentially, it's another kind of tweening. If we now take a look at the spreadsheet editor, we can see that once again we have these keys that are offset from the main key on the top bone here, You could put a key there on the top bone as well if you wanted, but it is unnecessary, of course. But what you can see is that the key blocks are much more easily identifiable as what goes together with what else. And also, of course, when you grab things and you start stretching and changing time like this, as you can see, everything remains much more tidy and in line with one another as you would expect it to be. Working this way also has other advantages. Of course, on a simple, two-bone swinging pendulum thing like this, it's not making a huge amount of difference. However, let's have a look at something going on in a character motion here. What you can see we're doing is the spine is turning across and this arm is coming up. If we see the keyframes for the spine, it sort of hits an extreme here, but then it sort of slinks out on itself. So the spine's got its own internal little follow-through action going on there. And of course you can see that the arm is overlapping in time ever so slightly there, whereas the spine here is arriving at that point at 103. The arm is not arriving until 104. What you can see this does is it sort of shoves our motion timing about incorrectly. If you just look at how much the arm is moving there on each of those frames, you're getting this nice smooth motion. You then get this sudden jump of big motion at 104, as of course the two timings overlap one another out of sync. You then, as the spine comes to rest, you see you get this other little click down on the arm there, as again its time is overlapped slightly. The spine sort of comes to rest here at frame 106, whereas the arm, being offset in time, comes to rest at 107. It gives you this ugly little click in your animation. It's a very swift action, and so it's a little hard to perceive, but if you watch you can see it, how the arm sort of does this little stutter at the top. That is something else that you can get if you rely purely on offsetting keys in time. Once you get into more complex hierarchies, they can easily produce a stutter as you get further down the hierarchy, in this case working down the spine, then down the arm, into the hand, wrist, etc. What we'll see, however, is if we take the keys for the arm there, which are currently arriving one frame later than the spine, and we push them back so as they are in sync with the spine, then what we see, of course, is that our overlapping action, as the spine is sort of dipping one way, the arm is dipping down the other, more or less retaining the position of the wrist in space here. He's sort of working his body to hold his hand in place. And you'll notice, of course, that that ugly click that happened at that point is completely gone. What do we simply do differently? Well, we would just build in some sort of an in-between if we wanted to have a little follow-through or overlap. Perhaps having another little frame here, again at the 104, so as the arm hits up, follows through and comes to rest, like that, still keeping in time, still giving us overlap, but without any ugly sharp clicks or sharp and sudden changes in the rate of motion of that part. We've managed to make it an awful lot smoother. Is there anything else? Well, yes there is. Let's start again. Once again, we've just got our keys in perfect line there, no overlap happening. But what we can turn to is our graph editor. If I bring up here the heading channel for this second bone, then what I can do is I can take all of the keys here and, for instance, with the TCB spline, I can slink their bias like this. You see, of course, this keeps the key position in time in the right place, but we're using the spline interpolation to cause an overshoot to happen slightly later in time. This is very much like, of course, the first method where we were offsetting keys in time, except now we're not having to offset the keyframes, we're offsetting the motion by how we're working the spline interpolation. Of course, here I've used TCB. You can just as easily use other spline types. A common one for doing this would be perhaps the Bezier spline, where you could grab your handle, or rather break your handle, to put overshoot on the outside of each keyframe, something like this, so as you could overshoot that motion at a later point in time, without, of course, having to change the actual keyframe position. And so once again, what we will see for all of these keys, once we've finished doing that, is that we still have this overlappy motion taking place there. Of course, the inverse is also true. So if you were wanting to underlap something, have it lead action, essentially shift it back in time, overlap its keys back in time, then you can work all of these techniques in the exact same way, but obviously on the opposite side. In this case, the curve example, that's a negative bias on the curve there. And you see that that gives this little leading action to the second item rather than an overlapping trailing action. So there you have it. Overlap, follow through, secondary animation, which very often on things like chains or tails will be little overlapped actions, as well as actions that are either a trailing overlap or a leading overlap. These are the three main techniques that you can use to perform those kinds of animation. And you should certainly experiment with them all, as you will find some more comfortable than others, and you will find some more suited to certain types of motions or hierarchies than others.